here. Hello, and welcome to a kind of informal panel slash discussion that we're having here for the Gauntlet community. This is about playtesting. We have traditionally on the Gauntlet had people running new games, trying out new games, trying things that they've created. A lot of it is informal playtesting. We've had some formal playtests there. And this month we're trying an experiment. At the end of the month, we've asked a lot of people to come and put sessions on the calendar for playtesting, trying that out. This session here is to maybe give people who haven't gone through the playtesting process as a designer or as a player a chance to see, get an awareness of some of the pitfalls that come out of this. But I'm going to introduce the two people that we have with us. I do want to give a shout out. A lot of the tech that we have in terms of RPG playtesting has come out of, I'm going to honestly say, Metatopia, as well as different publishers. But I do want to give a shout out to Metatopia, which has built these processes for years and now has a stronger online presence as well. So if you're interested in playtesting as an institution, as a thing you could do, please go and check out Metatopia. And I'm going to introduce you first, David MK, because I know you've had some experience at Metatopia, correct? Give us your background.
Sure. Hi, my name is David MK, pronouns he, him, and I've only had the pleasure of attending Metatopia in person once in fall of 2019, right before the pandemic started. So my experience with it is limited, but I can say from my experience with it that they've really worked hard, and they have a lot of success stories, and they have a lot of systems in place, and people in place that really want it to be your best experience if possible. And I've talked to Avi, who's one of the coordinators. I've talked to other people, and they would love for this to be spread to other places. They've got a lot of experience, a lot of great people that we can tap if we're interested in that. And for my first time there, I really enjoyed it. I had 4 playtest sessions. I brought 2 games. I both had a good and a bad session for each game. So, and it really varied depending on who was there. And I have to say, they really worked to try to get at least one of your play tests for one of your games with the right group of people from knowing the network. And that was really helpful. So for the play test that was most successful, that was because of it. When it was more of random people, right, that you couldn't kind of curate for, it was hit and miss. And that's what I found just at local conventions, online conventions. It's hard to get the kind of feedback you might be looking for without having a curated player base as well.
Interesting. And we're going to circle back to that. But our other guest is Ray Nedjadi, a prolific designer who has done a lot of informal play tests, but has also gone through formal playtest process with Evil Hat. What do you want to say about yourself and about what you've done before we roll into this?
Yeah, so I have really, since the beginning, since I first started, I mean, I had a few, like a lot of game designers, like a few false starts, I think, but when I really started getting into it, in 2019, yeah, I want to say I have to double check, but I think it was like February 2019 for the Sad Mecha Jam, which was this huge turning point. But yeah, ever since then, I've been playtesting my games, but I think things really started to take off because of the Gauntlet community. So I have been a part of the Gauntlet community since that online convention in October 2019, where I ran my games, which are essentially playtests because they're, I'm still working on those. But yeah, and I think I've been looking at my calendar before I came on here, and I have roughly at least run a playtest every week, right? Because there were some times where it'd be like 4 to 5 games a week. So it would even out for those weeks where I didn't. So since then, so the Gauntlet has been very, very helpful. in helping me like learn what helps my playtesting process and what helps my game design process. And yeah, but it also felt very different from the playtest process of Evil Hat. And also what I got out of that was also very different compared to the Gauntlet, right? So it's definitely something we can get into. But yeah, I'm super excited to talk about. I have such a passion for playtesting. Like, yeah, I love it so much because it's fun. It's already fun just to playtest. So
Interesting thing you mentioned. I just want to touch on that. That the idea of game jams as sources of feedback, as sources of playtesting. I know that Curious Cat and Mario, who've done a lot of that in the European side of things, mentioned that specifically as a useful feature for jams that have been set up, and I hadn't kind of put that together until you said that. So what I want to do is like start out with, before you go into a play test, like what should a designer know? What should a designer be thinking about? Like how do you structure or approach that? We may have different perspectives on this, but let me kind of switch order. Ray, let me have you start with that. When you're going into the kind of play test that you enjoy, let's what do you think the designer needs to have in mind?
yeah. So I see a lot of people talk about like having just enough to play test, like Spencer Campbell, for example, calls it the danger room, like from the X-Men, like having just enough to have a mechanic and play test that. For me personally, I find that doesn't help my process and my game design process. I need to have enough to quotation mark trick the player into thinking it's a complete game. So usually there's a yawning abyss of the GM side, right? So there's no GM moves, there's no GM structure, whatever. Like I make that up. Like so with Apocalypse Keys, there was nothing on the GM side. When we first went in, I didn't even know how combat was going, but I just needed enough to trick the players into feeling like this is a complete game. But like on the Gauntlet, you tell people this is a playtest. I'm just going to do my best to make this fun, but things could fall off the rails at any moment, right? Because I'm doing my best, but at the same time, I need like the character keeper, like for a player to see it and to see the sheet, to see the character keeper, and they cannot discern the difference between a complete game and a game that helps me, because I notice that if I provide that context, then I see more of like how the different mechanics connect to that context. Like so I like to have a complete thing from like character creation, if the game has it, all the way into the session. I like to go from beginning to end, but once again, this is what helps my process, because a lot of the fine tuning I do with my game design is so dependent on that context, on player perception, right? So, but definitely there are different ways to go about it.
But that's the really important point, because we do get people asking sometimes about, can they run their game? Can they play test their game? Does it have to be complete? As long as you're clear to the players,
it just has to appear complete.
Yes.
Right. You just need that illusion. I think that's like, even if it's not true, because you don't need much for the players. Players are so inventive and so intuitive, and they'll, especially like Gauntlet players, right? Like they'll know how to work within what's available, right? So yeah. But honestly, I've seen people have a lot of success with just barely any mechanics just to test things out, right? And that works for them. So yeah.
David, let's talk about your experience and what you perceive as important to a designer going into that playtest process.
Yeah, so I have a graphic design background, and so when I was going through that phase of my life, I'm still partially there, is we have a lot of critiques. We have a lot of we have to think of the customer, the user in mind for that. So that has really informed me over the years. And now that I'm doing entrepreneurial development for startup founders, similarly testing ideas. So that has helped to shape my sense of testing. And I love it. There's some people who absolutely fight it, but for me, it helps to communicate expectations and how you frame it. This is what we're going to be spending our time on. And when you're in a 2-hour session, which is what I'm setting up for the Gauntlet based on Metatopia, you want to really frame it to get the best out of it for everyone. So it is a little bit like work in a way, like you have some sort of objective usually. You usually have a question or some vague notion, if not a specific question in mind of this is what I want to find out. Because if you don't know, it's hard to calculate, hard to determine what you might need to change in your game, has been my experience. So I have done playtests where just sort of like, I got this loosey-goosey idea, let's put it out there and see what we think of it. And that's been kind of like more of an emotional response. And I think that can still be valuable. Like, is this fun? But I've also had playtests that are extremely focused. Like, I just want to go after this one mechanic. I don't think it's quite right. And there's a whole range, whole continuum within and beyond that I think it's really on the designer to decide what do they want out of their, playtest. If it's just for fun, that's fine. But then you have to think, well, how am I going to measure that? How am I going to know if this is successful being fun? Is it stars and wishes at the end? Is it something else? But for me, when we went through Metatopia and also through Gauntlet and other conventions, I have at least one question in mind of what I want to try to answer. And most of the time, I will actually share that with the players if it's like more of a focused playtest and say, this is just going to be about this. To help guide the play. And sometimes it works, sometimes players ignore it, and you just kind of have to roll with it, right? And the adage that I keep hearing again and again is that players are really good at showing you that there's something wrong, but they're really bad at showing you how to fix it, right? They'll come back with suggestions and whatnot. And this is the same in many different kinds of design formats. Graphic design, you'll have a customer say, I don't like that color. Maybe it should be purple, right? They'll just start throwing stuff at you. So when enough people are telling you that they're not having a good time in an area of your game, that's a really great information. Then it's up to you to decide, what do I want to do about that?
Yeah, I saw this yesterday, someone talking about like the most important thing in UX design is that your users will tell you when there's a problem, and they're very good at that. But giving you a solution, they are not good at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we should rely on them for it. I mean, it's great to get feedback. Like sometimes you get real gems because you're sometimes like really stuck in your game head, right? And you're like, I can't see beyond it. And sometimes you get some really great epiphanies or comments. But I would personally let it like marinate, like process, take down everything. And then over time, go through it, kind of like you're sifting through the information and figure out, well, what about this is compelling or useful? And then you can test those individual data points or those feedback comments to say, yeah, this is great, or no, this isn't the kind of game that I want to design right now.
Yeah. I do want to jump in and just say that another super important thing that helps me playtesting is having the CATS document. Like I used to not be consistent with having, so for people who don't know, but it's a thing that a lot of people use in the Gauntlet. CATS is concept, aim, tone, and subject matter. And so it's a really good like overall look at the game. And so when I create the CATS, I really try to create what I think the game is. And so when I first did it for Apocalypse Keys, I really want to stress I was not sure. I was like, I think this is the CATS. I think this is what the game is. We'll see when we actually play it, right? But at least it's a starting point. And then each time I play tested and ran the game, the CATS would get tighter and tighter and tighter. But having that really helps players, like hone in on, because like getting people on the same page for at least the themes is super important. And second, like what David was saying about, I know we're going to go into more detail about this for sure later, about what to do with the feedback and what feedback is helpful. But I do want to say, like, I remember being impressed with Girl by Moonlight also had a open playtest through Evil Hat, which is also a Magical Girl Forged in the Dark game. And by Andrew Gillis. I almost like blanked out on the name in that moment. And so what they wrote at some point was really interesting to me, because they said, if you have any feedback about the game, please tell us what you had problems with, what you had trouble with, or what wasn't fun, but don't give us any like mechanical suggestions or design suggestions. Like just focus on what the problem was. And the fact that they spelled it out like that, I was like, oh, I should have done that. Like I realized in hindsight, like I should have done that, but yeah, so nowadays I do that for sure, and it really helps, especially if you're it's an open playtest and anyone can access it. I feel it's very, very helpful to do that.
So on a couple of different levels here, setting the expectations for the players about what the game is, about potentially if you're doing a focus play test, what you're looking at, what the questions you have are. And I like that we've established we've got kind of more free form, trying everything out sort of play testing process, and we've got more focused, asking questions, looking at a particular mechanic play test. Both are useful, but both involve setting very different expectations for your players. So Ray, when you go into the playtest, when you're actually running, like what's your advice during that process? Like when you're actually at the table with something you're trying out as a game facilitator, what do the people need to be ready for? What do they need to expect?
Yeah, so what I like to do is because I will say first off, usually you are the GM when you're playtesting. In all my playtesting, I think it's only happened like a few times where that wasn't the case. Shout out to Leandra Pondok. Thank you for running the Twilight Throne for 16 sessions.
We'll definitely talk about
yeah.
other person playtesting and blind playtesting.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so as the GM, what I do beforehand is I write down for myself, just so that, I mean, it's all in my head, but I write it down in a space that I can refer to. What I want to keep an eye out for, what I'm not sure about, right? Just so that I can keep it in mind as we play. And then while we're playing, I make sure to keep a poker face on when I see a player struggling with like a move or a trigger. And I try not to tell them, no, this is supposed to do this. Like this design is supposed to, I sort of like stay like, and I see how the players try to figure it out themselves. And I try not, I think one of the worst things you can do as a designer is to say, no, that wasn't the intention. That is supposed to do this and this, because the player's not going to care what your intention was, right? Like at the table, what only matters is what makes sense to them, what is intuitive for them, right? What lines up with their expectations and experience. And I find that very often people will not realize what they struggled with. So during the feedback later, it won't even occur to them to bring up, yeah, I had a hard time with this trigger and this part of the move, or because they're problem solving it in the moment, right? But I take note of it as a GM and as a designer. Okay, so this trigger, they tripped over this. I'm gonna take note and see if other people would trip over it also, right? And I also pay attention to like what player choices were made and if they are the same ones other groups will make also. Yeah. So and then finally at the end of the session, I write down stuff that I'm pretty sure that I'm going to change, unequivocally in the next playtest. But I also write down stuff that I'm like, I will just keep this around for now and see. I'm not sure about it yet, because I think another bad habit is when game designers reflexively redesign after each session. I think that's one of the worst things you can do, because like it becomes a situation where you're just reacting instead of just going like, well, maybe it just happened this time with this group, with this player. Like I need to, like a good example is in Balikbayan, I would get conflicting feedback about it. Some people would say like, oh, the Duende playbook is so overpowered. You can do anything with the Duende playbook. It's ridiculous. And in that same group, the other person will be like, yeah, the Saint in comparison is such an underpowered playbook. Like you can hardly do anything. And in another play group, I'll have the exact opposite, where people are like, the Duende is way like underpowered. I couldn't do anything. And then I was like, yeah, the saint is so overpowered. And when I tried to tell them, like, they'll give me that feedback, and I say, no, I had another group that said the exact opposite. People won't believe me, right? And they don't realize it's I'm not going to get too much into the weeds, right? But basically, like, they don't realize there's a lot of your personal interaction with the game, right? So that's why I just think it's important to take notes and also not defend your design. I think that's also really important. I learned that from Lucien Kahn. Lucien was like, just write it down and just say thank you and don't say anything else. Just like, just write it down. Like, you're not here to defend your game.
That's
jump in
great
too. Oh, sorry. So yeah, when I was teaching web design, we were teaching the students to make their early versions, their crappy versions that they felt embarrassed about, and to take it to someone, often like a family member, and have them go through it without saying anything, right? That was a real eye-opener, because people are bad at self-reporting things that are wrong. So anytime you can record, like this virtual gaming is actually very good if you can record a session, because then you can also not have to worry about taking notes as much directly as a GM or facilitator. You can observe the behavior, and then you can actually go back and say, oh, at 25 minutes, someone was giving me a strange response, or there was a long pause, and you can interrogate that moment if you're able to. Sometimes people are just, thinking, or they're distracted or whatever, but those opportunities to see it in action are gold, because then you can maybe follow up with that person if they didn't provide written feedback. Hey, do you remember what was going on here? Because when you're face to face, I remember doing this pre-pandemic a lot, trying to keep track of my players' behavior, my notes, what was going on in the game, and it was just a lot of overhead. So, I think what Ray is saying is just really fantastic, and it's a practice. Like, giving feedback is a skill that we don't really practice in our society. So taking constructive feedback and giving it are two skills that you have to develop over time as well, so you don't feel so defensive about your baby that you've been working on.
Let me tag on a couple of things on what the two of you have said, and then I want to ask David about your specific experience at Metatopia. Recording, super important. Now that we're playing online, make sure that you ask your players about recording, get their confirmation to be able to do that, because you need to do that ethically. And with playtest stuff, that's not stuff you need to post publicly unless you really, really want to. That's stuff for private reference, that kind of thing. So make that clear to the players, check in with them. Two, one of the things you're hitting at is one of the reasons that the gauntlet moved from roses and thorns as a concept that was very much workshoppy at the end of sessions. That was like, very much, what are your critiques, what are your criticisms, to more stars and wishes, where the wishes are things you'd like to see more of, things you'd like to see less of, focusing it that way. Because, and this is something that a couple of people made a point about, is people aren't trained in workshopping. Workshopping is a tough skill. I went my master's in writing, and I taught writing for many years, and workshopping is hard. It's hard to know how to respond to things. It's hard to figure out how to do that. It is a skill. So don't underestimate that you kind of need to structure yourself to be ready for that. So David, when you've done face-to-face playtests or the Metatopia playtests, when you were actually in process, were there any things that you hit that like maybe you weren't ready for, or stumbling blocks, or things that kind of made you change your thinking in the course of that, or just issues that you had?
So I was advised for my first time to Metatopia, to bring one game to play test twice, so that I could experience all of the first time to Metatopia workshops and things that they have. I pushed against that, and I brought two games, because I'm like, I live in the Midwest. I don't know how often I'm going to get that. So I had 4 playtest experiences, and for me, it was worth it doing that. So for me, the way that my playtests were scheduled was did the first one, I had space, did a different game, had space. So between my first and second playtest of each game, I had time to reflect and to possibly make changes. Now, both of these games I had been playtesting at local conventions and online here and there. So I knew there were things that were broken, right? So sometimes that would just get hammered more. So if you're not accustomed to someone stomping on something that you know is broken, that can be a little disheartening. So you can either announce that ahead of time, in which case some people will still ignore, or you can just get that poker face line and say, oh, thank you very much. So that was an issue that came up again in some cases of people recognizing something was broken and telling me about it for 5-10 minutes. And in other cases, you'll have people want to suggest changing your brand. You'll have people wanting to suggest changing terminology names. You'll have people wanting to help you. And that's something that you may not be prepared for if you go there with your first gameplay test of the overload of feedback. And synthesizing feedback is another skill that takes time and practice to develop, to sift out good from bad for what you want to do with your game. So we have feedback, we have synthesizing information, we have all these skills that are not usually recognized as part of the design process that you have to take on in your journey as a designer. And for me, the people who were very good, who understood the process and who set aside their own preconceived ideas were the best people, and I would talk to them after the event. I would follow up with them. So there were I would say less than half of the people that I play tested with were really good to follow up with. And that was a high percentage. So at Metactopia, most people understand playtesting. And most of the time, my experience has been pretty good. But I still got some people who I think by Sunday, they were just cranky. So you want to gauge a lot of different things going on if you can, not to overwhelm the designer, but there can be factors outside of your game that can just derail the playtest. And if you see something that's disruptive or whatever, you may have to just halt your playtest or say, you know what, I think I've gotten what I've gotten, and walk away.
I will say my first experience at Metatopia presenting a game, I had a player who spent 2 hours literally saying, you should just play this in Primetime Adventures. You should just play this in Primetime Adventures repeatedly, to the point when we were done and he left, the other people were like, oh, we're very sorry. That's not how these usually go, that kind of thing. So you've got to be ready for that. You got to be ready to filter. So let me come back to you. Good feedback versus, let's say, less useful feedback. Can you talk about that process? I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the blind process that you've gone through versus the online.
Definitely. So I think I want to, let's see. So there are 2 tracks, right? And so what I have settled into as of late, maybe I'll talk about the open play test first, the blind play test with Apocalypse Keys and how that went. So I think first off was it's no secret that most of the designers at Evil Hat are white dudes, right? And so I am not a white dude. And so I think, unfortunately, Evil Hat didn't take that into account when we did the open playtest feedback. So it was the first time that we tried having a Discord server, because before that, Evil Hat was doing an email group. I was part of the email group for Girl. Do you remember email groups? Anyway, so we did that for Girl by Moonlight and stuff. And I said, I think we should do a Discord server because that's what, it's just the science of the times. Everybody uses Discord, right? And so This
So,
is
so that's a real change in dynamic. Like that's a
that
huge
is.
change. Okay.
Yeah, because the designer is now there and you have direct access to the designer, right? Which I didn't up to that point. I had been playtesting my games on the Gauntlet, like through the Slack and talking to people, and so I didn't have any problems with that. Like I have to state that as long as you are not a white dude, you are usually not in a safe position, right? It's just the way things are, right? I take that into account. Um and but I still wasn't ready for the Discord server and how that played out. And so I saw the difference because at the same time Eva had was running another blind open playtest for Project Perseus, right? Which is also a fantastic game. And so I saw the difference in how I was treated as a designer versus the white dudes who were treated with Project Perseus. So um and it's very difficult, like as a marginalized person dealing with the microaggressions, because it's never directly it on the surface it doesn't seem like there's a problem. It's just that there's a hypercritical, like I realized very quickly that I was not given the same space, right? I was not given the same concessions. I was not I had to prove myself, which I'm used to as a femme perceived marginalized person, but I wasn't ready for that because I'm from the Philippines. I wasn't ready for that added layer of race on top of it. So that was already really quite difficult. I had to defend the design a lot of the time. I had to deal with a lot of people giving unsolicited feedback before they had even played the game. So before they had read the game. So that's what I mean when I wasn't given the same space or the same concessions. And my answers weren't accepted either if I had given them. And so after that, with the feedback, unfortunately, like if I'm going to be honest, like 95% of the feedback was not helpful. It was very contradictory. It was very hypercritical. It was basically expecting Apocalypse Keys to be another game. And it was compared to, like, basically, it was quite obvious that, yeah, but it was hard for me because, like, at the time, I didn't have a way of perceiving that the feedback wasn't helpful. So if it wasn't for the help of like Sean Nittner, project manager at Eva Hat, who also became like a developmental consultant and who helped me a lot with the design of Apocalypse Keys. So it took Sean looking through it and being like, no, we had this exact same mechanic in Aegon and no one had a problem with it. And so, or we had this exact same thing. Like the backlash was really surprising. Like it was something that Eva Hat was shocked by. And so I will say this if you are a marginalized designer, especially if you're a person of color, you have to take your safety into account, and you have to take into account that I had to learn that way that I cannot expect public playtesting to be helpful for me. Like when I talked to other people of color afterwards, they all knew that it was going to happen. Like they all said, well, they shouldn't have let people have access to you in the first place. Like you cannot be placed in a position. There's no way that Eva Hat should have protected you better. Is basically, and so this is also something that Sean himself and Eva Hat themselves like realized after the fact, but it was very difficult. And so it literally took months of therapy to get through. It really made designing games very, very difficult for quite a few months. But yeah, and then so I was just so shocked because like the feedback and the playtest process was so much more helpful in the Gauntlet. Like I had been able to really hone and work on Apocalypse Keys and I had a lot of more helpful feedback. And so I think a part of it is also where I am right now is I always craft like the exact group that I want to playtest the game, and which is helpful for me as a designer, right? And also I try to, what I'm experimenting with is asking for help from GMs to run the game and then get their feedback. But in terms of crafting my own groups, I have two people that I always count on no matter what, who are in every group. Right? And so one of them is because he's a game designer himself, and we have like a very we see games the same way and we have the same insight of games, and like we're just on the same like level in terms of like communication, because there's so many different games, there's so many different types of games. What matters is what kind of game you want to make, what is fun for you, and who you want to play your games, right? So he and I are like on that same level, and every time he gives feedback, it's usually in the form of questions. It's usually, well, what, like, this is very cool, I had a fun time with this, like, what is your intention here, what kind of themes are important here, or what are you trying to do here? So he's not telling me what to do, he's just helping me clarify what I want to do as a designer, which is super, super, super helpful. He has a background as a professor, and I think that's part of it, right? And then the other person, she's always in every single game because she is, well, this is Sherry, Lowell's, like wife and everything. So Sherry's in every game because she's very good. She wants to always solve problems, right? As a player and as a person. And she always puts story first, and she doesn't think in mechanics first. And so it's really helpful. So if I design a game where the mechanics get in the way of what Sherry wants to do, I know I've done something wrong, right? So those two combined, and then the other person, like Josh, he's more like tactical. He will use the mechanics as best as he can. So I always have those two. And then the other two, it always depends, right? But for me, what works personally is if I think about the game I'm working on, and then I think about the player who I want to play the game, and then I just slot that in. And so it's like a rotating thing, but Josh and Sherry are like, they've been at the core for like several games for like about a year or two now. Yeah. So that's how it is. But yeah, so that's what works for me. I find that's extremely, extremely helpful. And so for a while I thought, oh, is it bad because I'm just using the same two people, and then does that make things, but it actually has helped me as a designer, because both Josh and Sherry know me as a designer, and they know the games I want to make, and so rather than a complete stranger who doesn't know the games, like what David is talking about, like your brand and stuff, right? Like they don't know you and they don't know the games you want to make, right? So they may give you stuff that's not, it's okay advice, but it's not really helpful for you, right? And what you're trying to do. But yeah, sorry, I rambled a lot.
No, I think that's fair. I think what I would say to take away from that GMs, creators, designers shouldn't feel bad about curating what they do, and that marginalized creators should be really aware, about going out into public playtest, that this is a space that is risky, and they have to prioritize their own safety. Yeah, I remember seeing some of the feedback you got, and what just the amount of people who like who are giving you feedback on a completely different game, that this game ought to be X instead of what you've got. Like then, and Hearts of Wulin, I will say, I have a little white dude armor, but I got a number of people who came in saying, oh, this game ought to do X, Y, and Z. And I had to assess that feedback and go, that's not what I want this game to do. Providing that or changing that way completely changes up like the basic dynamic of play. And you have to be willing to say no. You can look at the feedback, but you don't have to take it.
Yeah, and I think like what David said, it takes a skill, right? It takes practice to learn how to find what feedback is useful to you. So I really want to tell like first-time game designers, it's okay if it takes you a while to develop that skill. Like don't be hard on yourself as you figure it out.
Yeah. I would
yeah, I want to talk with you, David, about like what you feel about feedback here.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say what Race is absolutely, in my opinion, a great approach. So like when Avi contacted me, we had a phone call, about trying to get at least one game have the optimal experience. So she's like, what are you looking for in terms of an expert to be in this playtest with you? She's like, there can be someone who knows probability, there can be someone who knows, whatever. So I had to understand what I was looking for in my gameplay test. And so I said, well, in at least one of my games, Vigilance, which is a kind of about fictionalized version of the Bronze Age, that meets RoboCop, I'd like someone who understands the Bronze Age a little bit, because I want to make sure that it makes sense in that context. So I got someone who understood ancient. Actually, ended up with two people. And in another game, I asked for probability help, someone who knew dice. So like curating those people, that's a skill. Like Ray was saying, like understanding who you need when you need them, at what point in your playtest, is so important. And also, especially when you're designing your game, once you get to a certain point, who are you designing it for? So that's going to help you the entire way. It's going to help you when you market it. It's going to help you when you try to continue to sell the game. So there's so many advantages to that, but that's another business skill that you need to develop.
Awesome. That's a really smart approach to that. David, what will you say from your experience? What is useful feedback for you? Like what works? What's the best mode for that feedback to come in, and what has worked? And I maybe a spectrum of that, but I get your opinion on it.
So I will say whatever I can get is better than nothing. And each game, depending on where it is in the process, will need a different kind of feedback set. So sometimes I'll have a Google form. Sometimes I'll talk to people during or after the sessions. So for me, it's kind of a case by case basis. I have to understand what I'm looking for. I have to understand the participants if I'm able to. Metatopia supplies through a Google file folder variety of feedback forms that anyone can download and use. If you want to come up with your own, depending on how you want to see information, whether it's on a chart format or just text or whatever, honestly, the recording of the sessions is still, to me, one of the best ways to get it. But if you're, face to face, if you can get an audio recording, if people are comfortable with that, that can help give you some information. I just find that people's self-reporting is not as reliable most of the time, in my experience. But if it's that or nothing, I will take that. So you need to understand what can you do in the constraints that you have. If you're like in the middle of a hallway in Gen Con and you just got a game going for 2 hours, you just want to test out an idea, then maybe that you just record it on a piece of paper afterwards or dictate it to your phone. But if you have the opportunity to control the environment and everyone is into that, take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Ray, sort of same question, kind of for you. What has been the most useful kind of feedback?
Right. So I did touch on a bit with like how it's very valuable to me when someone asks me questions, but I have to be very careful, right? Like you have to resist as a player to ask very like interrogative, like, like tell me why you did this kind of questions, but more like, oh, so what was the intention here? Like, I think it helps me clarify as a designer, but also what's really useful, like the Gauntlet, I get so much valuable feedback, like especially off the top of my head, definitely people like David Morrison, Sam Zimmerman. And like what's really useful for me is when they tell me exactly, during this point, I had a hard time with this. I was trying to do this and I couldn't figure it out. Like as long as they don't tell me exactly like how to fix it, right? Because I think people don't realize I spend most of my time looking like that meme of the blonde femme with the calculations, right? Like when I'm designing, I'm extrapolating all these different like scenarios. I get really annoyed when someone gives me a suggestion of a mechanic that I had thought of like 16 ideas ago, where I just was like, oh, maybe this, no, it's not going to work, right? So I think it's more useful in general if it is, this is what I struggled with, this is what I was trying to do, and the game, I couldn't figure out a way to do it, right? And so, or I felt like this and I felt like that. And also like what's also super useful to me is when people say what they had fun with, like or what they weren't expecting. Like with Void Walkers, another thing that I've been playtesting recently, I was super surprised with how epic the characters felt. Like I really, when I had written the moves, because it's a PBTA game inspired by space opera, like Star Wars and stuff like that, and I had written the moves in such a way I didn't realize like people would just like think of like really amazing things. Like one person used a single move, Matthew, my partner, to like tank the stock market of an entire planet, like destroy the economy in one move. That was he's laughing about it over there. But yeah, so when I wrote that move, I hadn't thought he was going to do that, right? So I really, another thing that really helps me is when people tell me what they had fun with or what the game empowered them to do in ways that I hadn't thought of or imagined. That's really because my philosophy or what I try to aim for as a designer is how can I create this well-structured thematic playground where people can do what they want to do, right? Where they feel empowered to tell the stories that they want to tell within this space. But I mean, that's just my approach to it. But yeah.
Uh, let me talk on now. Let's kind of flip this, kind of related to what it's saying, but let's look at this from the player side. David, what do you think players need to know when they go into playtest for someone?
So what I've been doing when I go into playtest, I know it's playtest, is I will try to remember to ask the GM at the beginning of the game if it's not obvious already in the descriptions. So what would you like us to focus on, or do you have something for us to key in on? So most of the time on the gauntlet, this isn't meant to be a negative or anything, the GMs running the games have said, oh, nothing really, just play the game. And that has left me wanting more. But if that's what they want, then okay, I'll just play the game, right? That's what they're looking for. Or they don't want to bias me perhaps to something. Mm-hmm. So I try to ask, is there something that you want me to do in this time that we have together? But most of the time I get really nothing in response to that. So, but I'm going to keep asking. But I think one of the best skills for both the player and the GM is listening. It's another skill that needs development. Listening. Because you're looking for opportunities to make the game better. You're looking for opportunities to engage in the mechanics. I think players will sometimes forget that they're there to help the GM and they just go run amok, right? And some GM designers don't have the skill. I feel like this is a skills workshop to bring the people back, right? Either they don't have the confidence or whatever that is. And so I've seen some playtests just kind of go off the rails. And I get the feeling sometimes that the GMs, the designers, don't know how to handle that. They're just like, oh, wow. And then presumably afterwards, they're like wondering like, what did I do wrong or whatever? I don't know. But I think for players, you need to have patience. You need to listen. You need to pay attention to what the GM is asking from you.
Ray, other things that you think the players should know before they go into a playtest or best practices?
Yeah, I think definitely, like David said, like ask, right? That's super useful. Like, because I might say as a game designer, oh, I'd like you if you playtest at this playbook, for like the last rounds of playtest, the closed playtesting I did for Apocalypse Keys, I was super specific. I was like, I need to test this playbook and this mechanic and that mechanic, But yeah, but also as a player, I think it's really important to come to the game as it is, right? So like, because sometimes the designer will say, well, I was inspired by Bluebeard's Bride and I was inspired by this game. I was inspired by Monster of the Week. And so I think a bad thing or not super helpful thing, right, is if a player thinks, okay, so this is basically Monster of the Week or this is basically Bluebeard's Bride, because you can take the exact same mechanics and put them in a different context and it would just completely change everything, right? So I think it's really important as a player to come to the game as it is, like try not to compare it too much to like other games, right? Like in a way that's not like, because it is rarely useful to the designer, right? Because if they didn't design it to be more close like the game that you were thinking of, I'm sure that the designer thought of that, like especially if you bring up like a super big mainstream game like Masks or Monster of the Week, there is a reason why the designer didn't go in that direction, right? So And I think it's also important to, as a player, like write down what you're feeling in the moment. Like if you have the capacity to do so, depending on spoons and like, you know, how you approach things. But if you can like be like, I definitely need to bring this up later, right? And I definitely don't want to forget how I felt like in this moment. I think it's super, super helpful to write that down or take note of it in some capacity so that you can let the game designer know afterwards. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting, and some interesting things about the drawing out from there that the GM's presentation of a game can sometimes affect how people respond to it, and the question of blind playtesting versus doing the playtesting yourself. I think this is a little bit different than, say, board games, where there's an expectation of I have to give a rule set and so on. I've playtested a board game before, and that is a painful process of having people read through your rules very, very specifically and giving you feedback on that. Yeah, so don't assume that the GM hasn't considered X, Y, or Z. Don't approach it as that. Don't approach it as you're fixing the game. You are trying to help them find friction points and so on. So let me come to each of you. One last thing, any other pieces, advice, suggestions, things we should know as a playtest designer, as a playtest player? David, anything else you want to add to the conversation here?
I would, as someone who's been just recently come to this epiphany in the last year, playtesting for me has finally become part of playing the game versus playtest then the game. Because in my head, there was this clear boundary. So I have enjoyed playtesting a whole lot more as it's part of this long process of playing the game versus a stage that is done and then I move on to publication or whatever, which may or may not happen for some, right? So for me, I have really changed my mental mindset and it's become much more enjoyable. So I would say test often and test early if you can. It'll help you, or at least it's helped me, to get over the emotional attachment if I get it out there earlier than working on it. I know this from doing writing workshops and then putting my precious in front of someone else and then having them rip it apart. So that's another thing that people can consider. If you've got like just a bare bones idea, put it out there and see what happens. That's my suggestion.
Awesome. Ray, anything else you want to add to the conversation for advice, suggestions?
Yeah. I have 2 points. The first one is being a good GM can both be helpful to a game and playtest and detrimental to a game and playtest. So I've gotten very interesting feedback in that I have been told, so Sean Nittner brought this up, where one of the problems is I am too good a GM for a game that I'm working on. So because if you're too good a GM, the players will just streamline. It'll become less frictiony, right? It'll become more frictionless because you as a GM are like skillfully like moving and shifting things. So sometimes, so that's something that I really had to consider. Like I just know it's my one of my weaknesses as a designer is that I'm a good GM. So it's so embarrassing to say. But so basically what I do, I keep that in mind, right? I keep that in mind where, okay, I know that me being a good GM can help me see the game at its best possible state. But then I have to think about, so how can I mechanize what I'm doing as a GM so that even if it's not me running, the game can still do that in some capacity at least, right? So that's the other thing that I did is when I approach other GMs to run the game, I try as much as possible to have it be a group. So for example, when I ran Apocalypse Keys, Lowell, I asked you to be one of the GMs because I was like, Lowell is like one of the best GMs I know. And he's super good at this emotional relationship stuff, which is the core of Apocalypse Keys. But I know that Lowell is also still learning the mystery, intuitive, like freewheeling stuff right? So you were like a perfect fit for like being one of those. And so so try to get different GMs who like are good at different things from you and struggle with different things from you, because I don't struggle with the intuitive making up stuff on the spot, right? It is, but yeah, so then that really helped me. So that's one thing. The GM aspect is something to consider. And then the second point I have is I really make games because I want to enjoy playing them, right? So that is, I make games that I want to play. I make games that are fun for me. So, but I also think it's really important, like David said, to play test early, because it takes skill as a game designer to get to a point where you know what mechanic is going to create what effect in what context in relation to every other aspect of the game. So that took me a while to get the hang of, to build that instinct. So instead, it was what I had to learn was get the game out there, play test it, and be like, oh, this is different from what I thought the game was going to do. Like I only started to feel a shift with Void Walkers, where I was like, oh, it worked like almost exactly like I thought it would. That is, I have to stress that doesn't happen a lot. like there's this weird time where like Apocalypse Keys, the problem with Apocalypse Keys was it ran too well from the beginning. Like it was this Frankenstein of all these different mechanics I like, but it worked well. And so I couldn't figure out how to fix it, or what needed to be tweaked, because it worked too well, right? So sometimes it helps if you just, I keep thinking about that one Magical Girl game that went nowhere. That was a hack of masks I did, and it was so awful. It was so bad. It is online, unfortunately. You can watch it if you want to. It is a train wreck of a game. But I learned so much from that, because it was an utter, because I really learned, okay, this is why it isn't working, and I'm learning so much from this. So, so yeah, so it's really important to get it out there, to play test, and also let the game become what it wants to become. Because games, the magic thing about tabletop RPGs is that it is a social thing, right? And so you can only do so much by yourself in your head when you're designing a game. And when it is alive and with other players, that's when the game gets closer and closer to the game that it really can be, while still being your game, right? So yeah, like just give it that freedom. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much to both of you for talking with us today. And I'm looking forward to our playtesting weekend and having a chance to playtest with both of you at some point in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you both.
And listeners, I'll have links to the show, to Metatopia, to both designers' websites, and if they have any other resources, we'll put those in the notes for you. Thank you again. Now, when to